Just taking a minute. Oh, there we go. Hey, everyone. I just can't stay away. I've had such a lot of interesting discussions recently, and this is going to be by far one of the more interesting, very close to home for me as a California girl. And I'm introducing or meeting Christopher Moritz. Welcome, Mr. Moritz.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you. I wanted to speak with Mr. Moritz because of his new book, Failed State, A Portrait of California in the Twilight of Empire. And basically, it's an argument analyzing the collapse of the Golden State, essentially. And I'll let him get into the details. But it's more than just, as his summary points out, an autopsy of California's collapse. He looks at historical parallels from the Bolshevik Revolution's destruction of Christian Russia to the ethnic cleansing of Rhodesia by Mugabe's communists to warn that this crisis is not restricted to California. It could be in the future for all of us. So a little bio, Mr. Moritz is a corporate attorney, investment researcher, and M&A executive, a third-generation Santa Monican. He grew up in the heart of Southern California and resides in the same home his grandparents built in the 1950s. That is very cool. He attended Santa Monica High School and is a graduate of UCLA. He also holds an MPhil in, I knew where this was going, in modern European history from the University of Cambridge, because it is Cambridge and Oxford who have MPhils. Chris attended New York University School of Law for his JD. His career spans international finance, corporate strategy, and geopolitical risk. As a former vice president in cross-border M&A for one of China's largest state-owned investment banks, he's one of the only Western executives to have navigated the opaque world of China's state banking sector from within. Later, as a White House appointed senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Commerce under President Trump, Chris helped shape critical policies on foreign investments, tech transfer risks, and national security, confronting threats to America's economic sovereignty. With deep roots in California and a global career that spans corporate boardrooms and national security corridors, Chris brings a singular perspective to the intersection of crime, governance, and geopolitics. A recurring guest on Tucker Carlson's show, Chris is known for his bold, uncompromising commentary on the crises eroding America's civic fabric. And his debut book, congratulations, that's impressive, Failed State, is a searing indictment of California's descent into chaos and a cautionary tale for the nation. Well, let's jump right in. Sure. With a background like yours, you didn't have to do anything as agonizing and tedious as write a book. So what led you to feel moved to write this debut nonfiction work? And again,
so, there's many angles and facets to California's decline we could talk about forever. But I focus on one area, one vertical, if you will, which is the crime factor. Mm-hmm. And the reason I looked at this issue and wrote a book about it is because, like many Californians and like many people in Los Angeles, crime came to my doorstep.
Oh, I'm sorry. What happened?
So in 2023, in one weekend, my house was home invasion style burglary 2 nights in a row by an MS-13 gang member. Who had been twice convicted to state prison on gun charges, deported to El Salvador after getting out of jail under the Trump administration in 2018, and then came back into the country and into California during the Biden years, during all the chaos at the border. He went on to commit
if I may, Mr. Moritz, can I just jump in there? Are you going to tell us what happened with the home invasion, or?
Well, I was asleep at the time, and my brother was also asleep at the time of the house, and on both incidents, we were in different parts of the house, and we have a little casita, which is where I was, but my brother was in the main house, which is where the guy was just looting everything we had. I lost every valuable I have. I mean, that doesn't really matter. It's that we are okay and didn't have a violent confrontation. But nevertheless, I mean, this is not just a thief look in desperation, right? Or a kind of a passive burglar. This is an active, violent criminal with gun charges, with violent felonies in his background. He had his face tattoos removed when he was in El Salvador, so it made it easier to get back into the country. And when he was arrested in Ventura County to the north, he had on him stolen loaded gun with body armor, which is a felony, by the way, for a federal crime, for felons to have body armor, knives, like weapons of war, and by all indications was a violent individual willing to confront victims with violence. In fact, when the police interrogated him after his arrest, which was at a stoplight with his wife and child in the back seat of his car, the police thanked him for not opening fire on him. And he said, "Don't thank me, because if my wife and kid had not been in the car, I was gonna kill you and have my last stand, because I'm not going back to jail."
Oh my God. So I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I just want to get the full impact of this shocking story. So I guess my questions are, how did you know there was a home invasion? Did you wake up? Was it in the morning you realized? And how did it happen a second night?
Yeah. So great. These are really great questions. So the first night, well, actually, on both incidents, my brother and I were asleep. And I woke up in our little casita, and it's not a huge place, but just a little tiny back house, ADU. And I came into the main house, and the doors were all open. The place was a mess. My room was destroyed and stripped. All the bedrooms except the one that my brother was sleeping in were in disarray, and obviously had been subject to a robbery or burglary, I should say. So we call the police, and the police take 15 hours to show up. And when they finally arrive, they tell us, well, it took so long to get here because we're dealing with so many homeless overdoses. So the next night, I mean, we're obviously in shock from this. It's a very startling, violating kind of experience. And you would never in a million years think that could happen immediately the next night. But he obviously thought there was more to take, so he came back. And the second night, he broke through a window on our kind of downstairs area. It was much more violent kind of assault on the house, if you will. And, he took just the remaining things. I mean, the guy was taking sunglasses. He was taking everything he could think of. I mean, Easter eggs. Like, there was no limit.
Was there someone in the house?
At that point, we obviously thought on the second night that we were being targeted. Like, this is not just a random burglary. And your mind goes in a million places, and it's a paranoia that comes in. The house really has never felt the same. And which is a shame, because it's my grandparents' house. So anyway, that was the robbery. And
how did you find out the second night? Did someone wake up? Did you hear the?
Oh, same, exactly the same way it happened the first night. I came back to the house from our casita, and the place was in disarray. And my brother, again, a sound sleeper, I should say, was asleep in his room. Yeah. But I mean, he could have been inches away from my brother. We assume that.
Oh, that's one of the worst stories I've ever heard. I mean, how would you ever feel comfortable again? And how long did it take the police the second time? 17
hours.
And what reason did they give you the second time for the delay?
No reason. It's
unbelievable. I can't believe it.
I mean, it gets worse.
How does it get worse?
Because the worst part of it was that this whole experience exposed that justice is an illusion in California. Mm-hmm. So after he was arrested, and by the way, again, as I said, he committed like a dozen of these exact same style burglaries in LA County and Ventura County. He even robbed the judge, a famous criminal judge who presided over the Michael Jackson wrongful death trial. Just a little, side note. And he ultimately was only sentenced to 2 counts of these crimes in Ventura County, a different jurisdiction than where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And he was sentenced for those 2 counts to 2 years, which he'll probably serve less, and a $300 fine.
What?
And the reason he wasn't charged in LA County, by the way, he was never charged for the crime against my family, because like so many property crimes in California, they're simply decriminalized. They're simply not enforced. Because at the time, our DA, George Gascon, was using his prosecutorial discretion to not pursue these kinds of theft crimes, and police kind of respond accordingly. Mm-hmm. So the only reason I was even identified as we identified him is because my credit cards were found amongst other stolen property. But after all of this happened, after I learned these details and the shock that I experienced as a result of this kind of revelation, mm-hmm. I started talking to police officers and to prosecutors to get a sense, way before there was a concept of a book, of just how this could happen, what is actually going on in my home state and in my hometown. Yeah. And the first prosecutor that I spoke to is this veteran female prosecutor, very well-renowned for defending victims' rights. She's now a victims' rights advocate. I told her this story exactly the same way. And she said, what's so remarkable about your story is it how relatable it is. Yeah. And I stood back, and that was relatable. How could this be in any way relatable? Right. But yet, as I dug deep into this issue, indeed, we find that California is a state where you are more likely to be burglarized, assaulted, robbed, and carjacked than any other state, and in some instances, double the chance.
Oh my goodness, that's so shocking. And can I just say, as someone who grew up in California, this is not characteristic. I mean, this is new, right? And so let me quickly ask you about this crime issue, and then we'll get to the big picture. Why does California keep voting for policies like this? I mean, and I guess just to ask that in a little more detail, rich people, in my experience, vote their interests. And in this case, it's the elites of California, especially LA, but also San Francisco, who keep voting for more homelessness on the street, more drug leniency, more leniency for petty crime. What do they think is going to happen? Why isn't there a groundswell of, I want to be virtue signaling, but I really don't want my beautiful house to be broken into?
Yeah. I think that's the key question. It's an elusive question. I thought very deeply about this, and especially in terms of class, right? So California has been systematically driving out middle-class citizens for a long, long time.
Intentionally?
I think that there is a intention to create ultimately a bifurcated society between a consolidated power amongst a kind of technocratic elite. Mm-hmm. And that is a nexus around, of course, San Francisco and Silicon Valley, which runs the state and has done so since aerospace manufacturing left Southern California, and along with it, 700,000 manufacturing jobs. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a pursuit not only of virtue signaling, but ultimately to empower an underclass and create a permanent underclass, which they have done through demographic engineering, going back to the late 90s. Wow. 27% of California is foreign-born, and that has increased 60% since 1990.
Wow.
And, as your question, why they're voting this way, look, here's an interesting statistic. I think it's quite illustrative of the change that's happened. In 1994, 3 strikes, which was the very famous, very, very severe policy to put away repeat offenders for life after their third violent offense. And this policy, however controversial it kind of has become, in 1994 was supported by 70% of Californians.
Yeah, I remember that.
Go to 2014, Proposition 47, which is the law that decriminalized effectively stealing, or at least rendered theft under $950 to be a misdemeanor instead of a felony. That was voted passed by 60% of the state voters, I should say. So something dramatic happened between 1994 and 2014, and I think that if we really are like diving into what is the true cause of this, for sure we can say that there has been demographic engineering, through policies like sanctuary states, sanctuary cities, by providing welfare benefits to those who are illegal aliens and whatnot. There has been this redesign of the state population, and that new population is voting differently than it used to. Right. So that, I think, is ultimately a question of power. And then the beyond that, why are they pursuing this consolidation and power and political hegemony?
Right. Wow. So it was the crime breaking into your own life. And can I just say, as a daughter of California, a house built in the 1950s by your grandparents is very special and precious and unusual. And I'm so sorry, that happened. And through that eruption into your life, you decided to take a look at the big picture. How did it come to this? So give some other examples of, I think you said demographic engineering. Give some other examples of other forms of engineering in your book. Yeah. You go through them pretty systematically that led to this chaos.
Sure. Well, look, I think that from a legislative perspective, even like a policy perspective, this crime, I don't even want to call it a wave, because that implies a crest.
Right.
This new paradigm.
Right.
Begins in following a Supreme Court decision called Brown v. Plata in 2010, which found that California state prisons were in violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, due to their overcapacity. And they were overcapacity. It was 200% overcapacity.
Wow. So
the state of California had to conform to a mandate by the Supreme Court to reduce the prison population to 137.5% capacity. So all sorts of ideas were put forward on how to achieve that. But during this time as well, the criminal justice reform movement, this nascent kind of advocacy movement coming out of law schools like Stanford around the and forcefully advocating for de-incarceration, addressing the crisis of mass incarceration.
Right.
This comes to the fore. So the combination of the Supreme Court mandate and then this movement that's coming out of the law schools consolidates into a series of laws, beginning with one in 2011 called AB 109. And AB 109 is very interesting because I think it reveals as a kind of a microcosm of all of these sort of deeper issues about manipulation that I'm referring to. And I'll explain why. So AB 109 transferred 27,000 prisoners from state prisons to local county jails on the basis that these prisoners were nonviolent. So it's called realignment. And the trick to it was that the definition of nonviolent was manipulated. And under this law, nonviolent would pertain to the last crime for which you had been incarcerated, and not your entire criminal history. And over 50% of these realigned prisoners had violent criminal histories. When they got sent to county jails, which, by the way, couldn't manage like this new incoming population, and in many cases then have to release prisoners. 60% were rearrested within 3 years, and 44% were convicted. So this is like a first, I think, really the starting gun of this policy progression that takes us to 2020. But as we talked about, Prop 47 came in 2014, and that has been absolutely catastrophic, resulting in 115% increase in like smash and grabs and retail theft over 10 years.
So did you say what that bill did? I didn't.
Oh, sure. Prop 47 reduced theft under $950 to a misdemeanor.
Oh, wow. Well, that is just, who wouldn't assume that that's a green light to shoplift and break windows and grab things? I mean, this is like insane legislation. So quick question, back to the Supreme Court decision. Why was it not on the table for a, rich populous state, as it was at that time, to just build more prisons?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I've looked into it. It doesn't really make sense. I can only ascribe it to the fact that there were certain individuals that had the ear of the legislature and of Jerry Brown, the governor at that time. One in particular is a guy from Stanford named Mike Romano, and he led a advocacy institute at Stanford Law School, focusing very, in some ways, very radically on reducing prison populations by these kinds of, it's called like reparative or restorative justice.
Yes, I remember that. That seems insane.
Yeah, it is insane. I think California embarked on a suicide mission, basically, and by the time we get to 2020, we have a situation where, as I said, you're more likely to get burglarized, beaten up, robbed, and in some cases murdered, depending on what city in California you're in, than anywhere else in the country.
Unbelievable.
Oakland has a murder rate of 30.5 per 100,000. Okay, the national average is 5.5.
Oh my!
It's one of the most dangerous cities in the hemisphere.
Wow. It always was more crime-ridden than San Francisco, but I'll tell you, the last few times I've been to San Francisco, I'm advised at the airport not to leave the rental car in the city because it will be broken into.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 1,000. And I used to take the bus all over San Francisco in the 70s by myself as a child. I mean, which may have been insane also, but it was so safe. It was a small town, and LA too. There were neighborhoods that were dodgy, but in the neighborhoods that you're describing, the neighborhoods that I've been to, it was so safe in middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods.
You know what I think is really interesting about that framework, and certainly a recollection most of us kind of natives have to some degree, is that what we see now and what is different than let's say during the 1990s, which is a very violent period.
Right.
In the 90s, as several police officers from my sources very kind of viscerally illustrate, in the 90s, gangsters were killing each other to get this, territorial rights to a particular street corner. So they're selling dope street to street in certain neighborhoods. The violence is isolated within those neighborhoods, and they're targeting each other. Today, they're targeting us everywhere, all the time, and no place is safe. In fact, the shift in criminality into, let's say, the west side of Los Angeles, that is brand new. It's driven in many cases by juveniles, because gangs are recruiting essentially child soldiers as young as 10 years old.
Oh my gosh!
Because California shut down the state youth prisons, and so that all of the kind of procedural handling of juvenile crime now goes to county level programs. And in counties like Los Angeles, juveniles will never be tried as adults, even if they commit murder, under the former DA directive of George Gascon.
So minors are being groomed to be criminals because even less punishment their way.
It's a kind of like arbitrage that the gangs are playing because they're smart. They know you could recruit a 10-year-old to commit an armed hijacking, and they're doing that.
Oh my God.
Carjacking, I should say, and they can get, they go to court with their parents, they get out, and they go do it again, and they can do it again and again and again.
Shocking. Let's go back to the kind of ideology about restorative justice and mass incarceration, which I recall from the bestseller, huge bestseller, The New Jim Crow, got popularized about 20 years ago, right? And what was really behind that? I mean, suddenly everywhere it seemed like the whole criminal justice discourse shifted from victims' rights,
yes,
and the criminal as an offender, right? Even in the language, the criminal was a criminal and an offender, and the language shifted to, and language is so interesting because it carries ideology. A great deal of sympathy for the person who is incarcerated, right? No longer a felon, no longer a convict, but an incarcerated person.
Right. And exactly. The language is the key. And that's what I think betrays the totalitarian instinct of this movement. And as I dug into it, I realized that criminal justice reform is sort of a policy agenda, but behind it is an ideology that I call crime equity. And the idea of crime equity is ultimately that criminality is not criminality. It is a rational response to systemic oppression, racial oppression in particular. And so under crime equity agenda, which sort of percolates into the criminal justice reform movement at the more radical edges of it, we see that the idea of the justice system is no longer about sort of the kind of unique aspects of a case and truth and guilt based on evidence, but rather a societal sort of collective punishment. And it ultimately means a redistribution of crime from from neighborhoods that were where it was previously isolated to areas that had been otherwise protected. And I call this a redistribution of suffering.
Okay.
And so there's DAs like George Gascon, for most notably his team, which is was made up of public defenders, right? Even though they're the top prosecutor, like top cop in the state or in the county, there was this one in particular named Tiffany Blacknell, his chief of staff, who during the George Floyd riots and the burning of Santa Monica, which happened, I saw it, said kind of bemoaned the West Siders complaining about what's happening. And she said on Twitter publicly, "Go Crimea River." And it's illustrative of a mentality that we saw during that time period in particular, where a radicalism came into institutions and then became policy, and had these ramifications in areas like crime, that came to my doorstep.
Wow. That is kind of shocking. But I guess looking at this big picture, the whole kind of far left discourse that we are all, as white privileged people, kind of guilty already of not having distributed our wealth, in an equitable way, and centuries of oppression, that I can imagine, like the cultural image of the little old lady sitting in the witness stand saying, "That's the guy who broke into my house and stole my, dead husband's watch." and the sympathy that culture used to have for victims, I feel like it's just gone.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at it, I mean, Britain's further down the line with this, but the whole racial discourse has left white rape victims
Yes.
completely without any supporters, because if their assailants are men of color, the concern is, about the oppression that they've suffered as men of color. So I guess I'm just saying, in order to achieve or materialize the results of this shift in ideology, you've had a whole giant propaganda push that surrounds it, right? So I'm really wondering, where do you think that comes from? I know you may not have found a smoking gun, but the new Jim Crow didn't become a bestseller out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
At I think you said Stanford or Berkeley didn't become influential out of nowhere. So is there, I mean, I know you're very familiar with China. Is there Chinese money behind policies that are going to destroy our country? Is there Russian money? Is it, Soros money? Or did you not get that far?
Yeah, no, I don't believe that. Look, it's certainly, I heard stories when I was in the government that Chinese and Russian kind of influence was a factor in some of the George Floyd stuff. But in my research for this book, you can for sure identify the sources of funding for both policy actors like George Gascon and 70 other progressive prosecutors that George Soros organization put into office over like 10 years,
wow. So
significantly in 2020.
So it's Soros funding is the bottom line.
But it's not just Soros. I mean, there's other institutions. There's the Ford Foundation. There's the Arnold Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. There's just foundation after foundation of billionaires,
right.
Either dead or kind of actively involved, that have underwritten this this entire movement. And I think then the question is why?
Why exactly? Because billionaires, again, tend to protect it's not organic to think of a bunch of billionaires going, let's encourage petty theft, inorganic.
Unless you're motivated by one, enmity towards those beneath you, the middle class in particular.
Oh, wow.
Or, of course, the sort of animosity between it's a kind of, I call it kind of a reverse French Revolution, where the nobles and class are now directing their hostility at the kind of bourgeoisie, all of us living in just our grandparents' house,
right?
And they are insulated from the ramifications of these policies.
Let me jump in there. Are you saying, Mr. Moritz, this sounds like what you're saying, that the real elites have weaponized the underclass against the middle and upper middle?
Yes, for sure.
Wow. So when you say that, and that rings so true, not just with crime, but with so many policies, could it be a real estate grab, a land grab? Why would the elites be motivated?
That's what I think.
Go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, I think they're depressing the value of real estate in urban centers, and also in residential areas. We know that entities like BlackRock are buying up family houses. If they continue at the pace that they are, they could be actually owning 60% of single family homes in the United States by 2030. I think that if the logic of causing chaos within, let's say, downtown neighborhoods, reducing the real estate prices and prices for those, and also insurance premiums affecting that, and having a play on that, a trade on that, is conceivable.
They're shorting downtowns.
It could be. I mean, that is the big look. Soros should not be thought of kind of independently from his finance career. He is an arbitrager.
Mm-hmm. Explain.
The idea of arbitrage is that you have two assets priced differently in two different markets, and you profit from the delta between those two. Mm-hmm. So it's also, if you're applying it to real estate, you could conceive that, well, we have real estate, a baseline real estate price for, let's say, apartment building in downtown LA. And we we sort of then profit from the appreciation or depreciation, depending, of that same asset by the resultant chaos. Now, there's another angle too that I think is interesting, which is that I learned from multiple sources that I believe this is true. You can't verify it because, well, for obvious reasons, but George Soros may indeed be investing significantly into private security businesses. In fact, I was told this by a top-level guy in private security,
Oh my
by
God.
a former head of federal security for LAX, and one of the top traders on Wall Street who would know.
Okay, can I just jump in there? My husband is in the security field, and he said when he went to renew his license in New York State most recently that literally everyone, I hope this is okay, sweetheart, and not off the record, but literally everyone was like from Somalia who was applying for a security license, and that it seemed like the system had been changed to make it very, very difficult for for native born people to renew their licenses. I hope that's okay that I shared that out of school, but that's really interesting. He's like, there was this giant crowd of like Somalis, who were going into security. But anyway, please go ahead. That would be.
Well, there's another example that we can for sure verify, which is one of Soros's sort of fellow travelers, a billionaire named Pierre Omidyar. He was also funding these exact same initiatives and figures like Gascon, alongside Soros, and all the while he had also was investing into a private security app, like a technology startup that was to create an Uber for wealthy clients, based around private security. So that's been written about in the New York Post.
So fun fact: I used to be part of something called Civic Hall, which was funded by Omidyar and a couple of other tech moguls, and they were developing or investing in civic software, so municipal software, so they could harvest the data of everything happening in a city at a government level, to give extra intel for where to invest.
That's interesting. That's why I find it's. When I started the book tour, people asked me, like, is this kind of leftism, progressivism gone haywire? And upon further reflection, I actually think it's the opposite. California is not progressive; it's deeply reactionary.
Interesting.
Yeah, this small group of super wealthy,
right,
underwriting and backpedaling. Backing these kinds of initiatives that are hurting middle-class people for sure, driving them out of the state. In fact, 8 million of them left the state between 2010 and 2023. And then bringing in an underclass of essentially indentured servants and generational peasants,
right,
that are dependent upon the state
or on
their power.
Right, exactly. Or they're gardening for the technocrats. That's right. Wow. So what you're saying is really hitting home. Essential Teas, who's a friend of ours, says, wow, right on target. The elites weaponize the lower class against the middle class. The middle class is in the way of communism, fascism, aka tyranny. Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky all identified the middle class as an obstacle. And every fascist identifies the middle class as an obstacle, and certainly home ownership. Yeah. What you're saying is mind-blowing. And this piece about private security, I mean, if you think about it, what better way to kind of invade a country without people noticing there's an invasion than to have your own Blackwater essentially made up with allegiances to you rather than to the state or local government. Wow. So the description of your book also mentions billionaire anarchists. Is that who you mean, Soros, or do you mean someone else? Who are they? Who are you referencing?
I'm sorry, it was breaking up when your question.
The description of failed state also mentions as the bad guys behind all of this chaos, billionaire anarchists. We talked about the radical ideology. We talked about the gutting public safety in the name of equity. I think we talked about a cartel haven and open border zealots, but you've also mentioned anarchist billionaires.
Well, I haven't told you, the cartel stuff is really interesting, and I can get into it. But in terms of these billionaire anarchists, of course, Soros is the number one. I mean, he basically bought 75 district attorneys in the United States, which then covers the jurisdiction of most Americans. Okay, now 50 of those are gone.
Right. Wow.
So that's an improvement, but it does underscore the power of essentially small dollar donations for billionaires, right? We're talking about in the hundreds of thousands or low millions. It goes into a DA race, but is very consequential in the outcome because it's a asset class in a sense that is underutilized and neglected, and where there has been low demand. So a Senate race, which are now getting into the billions, don't have a very high return, for let's say a couple $1 million donation. But for DA races, you're buying that person.
Right.
Like that made the difference of why Gascon got elected and why 15 others in that during that 2020 period came into power over our major cities, every single major city.
Wow.
Soros is the number one, but there's others. I mean, like some of these foundations I mentioned, they're, sometimes even these foundations are kind of obviously have a kind of agency apart from the original, figurehead of it. So that's a different kind of institutional capture that's taking place. But, look, it's across the board. And I think, again, we have to go back. What is motivating these people? I believe it's not simply like white guilt or billionaire guilt. I think it is much more sinister.
And so we'll talk about the cartels and then talk about why California, because when you say what's motivating these people, and you're talking about really a multifaceted takeover, basically, and re-engineering of a whole state to make it not a democracy and not
correct. We're not a democracy,
right?
And it hasn't been a democracy since. I mean, we have had a one-party system where you have supermajorities in both houses, and every single statewide office has been under the auspices of the Democratic Party since 2012, continuously. In fact, you can sort of trace certain families that have more or less run the state since the 1940s, and that's the Browns, the Newsoms, the Pelosi's. They're all related.
Wow, that's so weird. Oh my!
They're literally related.
I get it.
But so the cartels is really interesting.
Talk about the cartels, and then I want to talk about why California, because as you're speaking, I'm really thinking about how extraordinary geographically and aesthetically California is. So I want to circle back to that after you talk about the cartels. Like, if you're gonna, I keep noticing. I'm sorry. Do you mind if I just finish that thought?
No, please. I'm sorry. It's just the sound is like going in and out. So I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. I'm interrupting you. You're making a lot of thoughts go off at once. But, I keep noticing how the chaos and the disaster from Maui to Pacific Palisades, other places, Northern California, keep happening in incredibly scenic, like unusually gorgeous, pristine areas. And I don't want to go too far away from the evidence on that, but, and then I keep thinking about, if you'll just bear with me 30 seconds, my mom lives in beautiful Corvallis, Oregon, beautiful. And every time I visit her, there's more insane policies around homelessness and drug use, so first people are welcome to camp outside the town, then they're welcome to camp in the Central Park where the elderly ladies used to go sit in the park. Now they can't anymore because it's full of needles. And, then they provide free a free store on Sundays, and then they provide bathrooms, and then they provide methadone and or a place to shoot up. And it gets more, and so what it's doing, and my poor mother and her friends are good liberals, and so every one of these policies, out of the goodness of their heart, they're like, yes, we have to do, look, we have homelessness, we have to do more and more and more for the homeless. But the bottom line is, it's their neighborhood that they're losing.
Yeah.
Right? Bit by bit, it's those beautiful bungalows, 1920s bungalows, that are becoming, sooner or later they'll have to move because the crime and
who's going to buy those single bungalows when they move?
BlackRock, exactly. And that's what's happening when you can't bid on a house in Corvallis, because BlackRock or Vanguard or BlackRock has already quadrupled your ask. So I just wanted to say that when we come back to why California, because out of it's so interesting to me that Michigan isn't the first state this is happening. California is the jewel of our nation.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So we'll go back to that, but talk about the cartels.
So the cartels control the entire criminal economy of California.
Whoa.
They have since the late 2000s, when they executed a hostile takeover of the narcotics trade in cities like Los Angeles. And they said to legacy black gangs like the Bloods and the Crips, if you sell drugs and we catch you selling them without our sanction, we will, quote, cut your head off.
Oh,
and
my
they meant
God.
it literally.
Wow.
So as a result of this, let me explain the mechanisms of control. The organized crime in the state of California is run from the prisons, which is, I think, quite shocking. But this was corroborated by every single expert that I talked to. The prisons are primarily the domain of an entity called the Mexican Mafia, which is domestic born, but is a vassal of the drug cartels, the Mexican drug cartels. So the cartels in Mexico have a syndicate network of Latino gangs that represent the majority of the gang population in the state of California. Mm-hmm. And they present majority of the prison gang population in the state of California. Mm-hmm. And because the prisons run the street, and the street is run by the cartels. So it goes way beyond narcotics, of course. It goes into human trafficking. It goes into even the theft ring. In San Diego, there's been it's not reported, but a spike in Mexico City-style kidnappings of wealthy families.
What?
And this is happening outside of, law enforcement is not getting involved in these. This was told to me by an LAPD senior director of the LAPD union.
Why would law enforcement not be getting involved? That's terrifying.
Well, they're using private security to extract these people.
I see.
So that's happening in San Diego. The cartels are running the entire drug trade in California, and of course beyond. 60% of the fentanyl coming into the United States enters through San Diego.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And what's really kind of interesting and awful is that as the drug trade got consumed by the cartels within California, legacy gangs that used to control that market have moved into other verticals. And primarily that's residential burglary. Hmm. And so part of the reason there's been a spike in theft crime and property crime, and also, violent property crime, is that the gangs couldn't sell dope anymore. Mm-hmm. So they had to find and it is an easier source of revenue. Just to give you a shocking statistic, in the United States, retail theft is $100 billion industry.
Oh my God, 100 billion?
100 billion in the United States. It's in the tens of billions in California. All of this is organized crime. So when you see the sort of hordes of looters go into a Nordstrom's, or even some of the retail crime at your CVS, this is not just like Les Miserables. Okay, they're not just desperate people; they are gangsters.
Wow. That changes everything. But arguably, devil's advocate, you've been making a very good case that it's kind of nefarious, powerful interests cynically re-engineering California. But when it comes to the cartels, isn't that just,
Oh yeah. That has nothing to do with crime equity or the billionaire sort of motivation on potentially real estate. It has nothing to do with it. The cartels are simply operating based on opportunity, right? They saw that there was an absence of and dereliction, I would say, of enforcement in the state, and they are able to use their networks of Latino gangs to exert control, and they do, and they it really doesn't seem to be. There's no course correction.
Right.
I mean, I think sealing up the border as the Trump administration has done is a big factor in that. But I mean, it's entrenched, it's diffuse. Yeah.
Unbelievable. So basically, you're saying it's organized crime as usual with a cartel face. Maybe in
Right.
the 50s it would have been Jewish mafia, but the impunity is what is allowing it to flourish. People.
I mean, look, Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General, disbanded a 100-year-old narcotics enforcement entity called the Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, and that was every prosecutor I talked to has said that was a big wound in the ability of the state to target drug traffickers, and yet Kamala Harris would sort of tout that she was tough on the cartels or took on the cartels. No one takes on the cartels. Right. Tom Homan does, but in this state, people fail upwards. It's not really about any kind of measurable success. It's about navigating the party. It's like China.
Wow, this is so this is the kind of thing that happens in truly corrupt societies. This is not an American way to do business. Holy cow. Well, you've covered the main topics, I think. Is there any other big piece of your book that we haven't talked about before we get to the last question of why California?
No, I think I mean I would just underscore that per your last point, it's not just a un-American kind of system. It is Latin America, right? It's a solid power consolidated within a small group of people. In fact, to be in the top 5% of earners in the state of California, you have to make like $750,000 a year. The top 1% are $1.5 million, right? Mm-hmm. And yet the bottom 30% make like $17,000 a year.
What?
The 67 times delta. And that is, as I said, I think that is the very illustrative of this underclass of dependence, and then a ruling elite that are then immune from the chaos that they've created.
Right. So. Wow. Okay. So last question, why California?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, again, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, but you're talking about a lot of vectors converging on this beautiful, unlike anything else in terms of God's gift to a state, naturally, this jewel of our continent, and ruining it basically, and it like with a lot of intentionality. I mean, you need to be a rocket scientist to figure out what'll happen if you defund the police, or as I said, no consequences for shoplifting, or get rid of juvie, which used to scare us all to death in middle school. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why did this unfold in the most perfect of states as opposed to Nebraska or New York State or Louisiana? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think it's sort of, the answer lies in the question, right? It is because California is such a ripe asset, and because we have such an enormous population, and because we're a border state, and because we have Silicon Valley emerge, and Silicon Valley is the most powerful sort of entity and force that the world's ever seen.
Right.
And so the growth in California's GDP rate to bring California from the fifth largest economy to the fourth largest economy, which happened this year, does not reflect the fact that 30-something% of Californians are on social benefits.
Oh my God.
Welfare, and then there's these enormous gap in the political economy between the classes, and this growth in GDP is reflective only of two things. It reflects inflation, and it reflects the performance of a few tech companies like NVIDIA that are based in California. So those entities have total power, and I think that's really why we see such extreme things in this state.
Wow. So people who could create a utopia are creating a dystopia. I wonder, apart from the real estate play, I'm just trying to visualize, if you're a tech bro, what are you looking at 5 years out? Like gated communities where what? Like how does this chaos serve elites who are not in the real estate biz?
Yeah. No, I look, I don't think your like average tech bro is thinking about these things. I think the big consequential societal changing forces are at a much higher level.
Right.
So that should be kind of viewed in that light. The legislature, by the way, I do think is it just a collection of radicals. Like I don't think the legislature, the individual like state senators who put forward some of these awful crime policies are thinking in terms of a real estate play or whatnot, or consolidating more of their power. I think they are just extreme radicals, but they are tools, right? They don't exist without their benefactors.
Right.
So the question is, why are their benefactors sponsoring people who decriminalize penal code?
Yeah. Well, I think you've given us a lot of answers. Is there any call to action, or should we just mourn California?
Look, there are some positive signs. For one, George Gascon was thrown out of office by a 20% margin and replaced by a moderate guy named Nathan Hochman. Prop 36 passed, I think, by 24% margin, which undid a lot of the really nasty stuff from Prop 47. So that's the reduction in penalty to a misdemeanor for those $950 and under theft. So that's been rectified. We haven't yet seen the consequences of that. I'm hoping that, especially on the DA side, that's going to have a galvanic kind of effect on policing and make police more proactive and interested in pursuing cases like what happened to me. Because when you have a DA that sets directives whereby even bringing the guys like my criminal to justice without any consequence, the cops just don't do it, and they're overwhelmed.
Right.
So hopefully that will improve things, but we have to have a leadership change at the top.
Right. Wow. So people have to run out and get this book, whether you're in California or not, because I am persuaded that this is a game plan that is being tested that could be rolled out for all of us. Yeah. And how do people follow you, Mr. Moritz, and where do they get Failed State?
Sure. Well, Failed State, certainly available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And then you can follow me on X at Chris G. Moritz.
Don't fail to get Failed State, everyone. Incredibly compelling, very important argument. Thank you for doing all this hard work. This former California girl really appreciates you, and I hope everyone reads the book and pays attention.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.